can I possibly do? What can I possibly do? What can I possibly do to slow down the destruction of democracy, to stop the supremacy of whiteness, to create political will where there isn't any, to protect my friends who are at risk for how they look, where they were born, how they speak, who they love, or how they present to the world. What, oh what, can I possibly do? That question lives in so many of us these days, doesn't it? The griefs of our age feel very, very large, the forces too strong, the pain too constant. We look around and we feel very small, sometimes even helpless, in the face of systems that seem immovable, and with bad guys who feel very bad and very, very big. Then we hear a story of a woman who could have asked that same question. She was a widow, her husband gone, her debts mounting, her children about to be taken and even enslaved. So she was up against the very worst, without protection, without power, and she could have easily asked, "What can I do?" She could have accepted her unjust fate and kept silent and simply withdrawn. But she didn't. She spoke. She refused the quiet resignation the world expected of her, and she took all of her need and she carried it to Elisha. And Elisha, the prophet of God, well, he didn't do what we might expect, right? He didn't give her a handout. Instead, he asked her this weird question. Well, what do you have? Her response at first, nothing. And when silence met her, she thought a bit more and added, well, I have this little jar, this little oil in it. And with that info, Elisha gives her some instructions that are pretty strange. Go to your neighbors, borrow their jars, empty ones, bring as many as you can. Now, this is strange, right? And can you imagine this poor woman whose life has been marked by so much loss? She's told to go knocking on doors and asking for empties. Like, this is humiliating, utterly embarrassing. To ask for something that doesn't even make sense. How are empty jars going to save her kids? But her need and her trust outweigh her fear. So she summons her courage, and she risks that embarrassment, and she knocks. And she has to speak her need over and over and over again. She's seen for everybody in plain view, right? Totally vulnerable. But y'all, her neighbors, they respond because she gives them a chance. And because she does, they get to be a part of a miracle. She acted as if hope was still possible, even in those crazy circumstances. And when she did, the oil began to flow. Enough to pay her debts, enough to live. And none of this could have happened without her taking this risk to show her need. But it also couldn't have happened without her trusting, certainly Elijah, the prophet, but also her neighbors, that they wouldn't judge her or dismiss her. It's a very brave and hope-filled thing to ask for help. And on the flip side of this story, I think about those neighbors. They're just doing their thing, right? And likely they have no idea of the depth of agony that their neighbor is in. But from what we're told, none of them hide behind their doors. None of them holler when the door knocks, "I'm too busy. I don't want any." Instead, every single one opens the door, and every neighbor provides the jar that they have. And remember, one jar, even if it was filled with precious oil, even one jar would not have been enough. It wouldn't have been enough, right, to pay off the debts, to save the kids, to buy the groceries, and to stop the widow's agony. It wouldn't have been nearly enough to have just one. But each neighbor did what they could, one jar at a time. And I see good news here. And I also see a real and practical guide for how we can manage this moment that we're in with the immense problems that we're facing. Instead of throwing in the towel or throwing up our hands at the enormity of everything, we can pitch in on our patch. Clarissa Pincola Estes, a Mexican-American storyteller, writes this: "In any dark time, there's a tendency to faint over how much is wrong or unmended in the world. Do not focus on that," she writes. We are needed. That's all we need to know. Ours is not the task of fixing the entire world all at once, but of stretching out to mend the part of the world that is within our reach. Any small, calm thing that one soul can do to help another soul will help immensely. We know, she writes, it does not take everyone on earth to bring justice and peace, but only a small, determined group who will not give up during the first or the second or even the 100th fight. Any small, calm thing that one soul can do to help another. Now, to me, that sounds not only reasonable, but doable, right? So, I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about how Jesus might be saying kind of the same thing to us over and over and over again. In particular, I was thinking about the scale of Jesus' instructions. Now go with me here. Jesus said over and over, love your neighbor as yourself. He said, love your enemies. It all boils down to those two instructions, right? But think about how personal that scale is. Because Jesus isn't saying, love all the neighbors of the world. He says, love your neighbor. He doesn't say, love the world's enemies in the abstract. Instead, he says, love your enemies. The ones you encounter, the ones in your life, your orbit, the ones that you have in your patch of the world. And I do think that this is essential for us to think about right now because it's orienting and grounding. I think of another time in Jesus' ministry when he offers instruction along with guidance to right size it. Remember in Matthew's gospel, and you had these righteous folks who were trying to make sure they were doing things right? They wanted to make sure they were doing enough, that in their lives they were serving Christ in the world. How are they to know if they had welcomed and fed and clothed and visited Christ in the world? Well, I'm going to remind you what the answer wasn't. The answer wasn't when you fed all that are hungry, when you welcomed all of those cast out, when you visited every single person who was imprisoned. That's not what we were told to do. Instead, we were told this: truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these siblings of mine, you did it to me. You did it for one. You did it for me. It's as if Jesus is saying, you're not expected to fix the whole world all at once by yourself. But he's also saying, you are responsible for loving the part of your world that's in your reach. That's how this mending begins. One act, one person, one borrowed jar at a time. Because we can't fix everything, but we aren't meant to either. We just do our part. Knock on our neighbor's door. Do the small, ordinary thing to mend a broken bit. And then God can multiply that good beyond what you or I or we can ever even imagine. So let's move from this miracle to the material. Because what the poet is saying, what the prophet's saying, what Christ is describing, it isn't fanciful or imaginary. It's not even spiritual abstraction. It's practical faith. Love in action. It's neighborly. It's lived out in kitchens and on sidewalks and in coffee shops and on buses, and we can actually see it. Now, I've been reading about the work of sociologist Robert Sampson and his team of researchers. I know, I just love a podcast and it gets me into reading and whatever. But in the 1990s, they set out to understand why some neighborhoods thrive and others don't. And they face the same economic challenges and remain trapped in hardship. Okay, so at the time, most assumed that a neighborhood's well-being is determined on the things that you might assume: wealth, policing, individual effort. But Sampson and that team, they thought it might be something deeper. So they conducted one of the most ambitious community studies that has ever been attempted, even till now, right in Chicago, and it's a city that is much on my heart right now. They followed thousands of families, mapped entire blocks, and studied how neighbors interacted, who volunteered, who looked out for kids, who stopped to help. And what they found, well, it totally changed the national conversation, because the single strongest predictor of whether a neighborhood was safe, resilient, and thriving, turns out, was not income or crime rates or even education levels, but what Sampson called collective efficacy. When a community has mutual trust and a shared belief that it is our responsibility to be there for one another. That's the significant thing. When people trust their neighbors to step in for a kid, to lend a hand, to keep watch, and act for the common good, everything changes. Violence decreases, health improves, hope multiplies. And this research corrected something in our social imagination. It showed that flourishing depends less on resources and more on relationships. That safety is born out of connection. The well-being of a neighborhood, it turns out, depends less on who has power, thank God, and more on how we practice we. That insight helped reshape public policy. But I think it can also reshape how we understand the kingdom of God being built right now on earth. Because collective efficacy, I think, it's just another way of saying what the gospel already said, that love is not an idea, but a structure. That faith is lived out in solidarity, that God's abundance is revealed when we act like we really do belong to each other, and when we realize we are a part of the work of God. In fact, we are a part of miracles. Now, this stuff, it's sociology. But I think it's also prophecy, and I know it's also gospel truth. Now, when I think about how we take this in, how it matters, and why it's not just kind of interesting intellectually, but instructive in times like these truths can help us know where and how to start. for collective strength to become more than an idea, and for solidarity to be more than a slogan, each one of us has to do some work, I think, some auditing to begin with. We know, obviously, that we need to turn out towards our neighbors, engaging in the brokenness and the gaps of our world, right? Okay. But we also need to turn in. We need to ask ourselves a few things and discover, what do I need? Where do I fit in the landscape of a shared life? And what do I have? What can I do that might help somebody else? Because for community to work, we have to come to it authentically. We need to bring what is real, our halfway filled jar, our truth, and our fragility. And it does require some risk. Like the widow, if we did this, we would be seen in plain view, open and vulnerable enough to name what we need, but more than that, humble enough to receive from others. That's where the gospel meets us, I think. Not in a fantasy of being the one that always has plenty, but on being human. When some days we're the borrower, and other days we're the lender. Some days we're the student, other days we're the teacher. Now, it's really easy to imagine ourselves as the ones with the stocked closet, oil for days, ready to pour generosity for others. But y'all, let's be real. Sometime we're standing there like the widow with not much left in our house, seriously uncertain about things, and maybe too proud or too afraid to say we need help. And yet, that is exactly where the story and where the miracle begins. Right there, in honesty and interdependence, in the courage to say, I could use some help right now. Across the country, immigrant communities are under attack. We're watching this. They're forced daily to resist assaults on their humanity, their families, their safety, and any one of them would be totally justified in saying, what can I possibly do? But I gotta tell you, after 3 years in this work, I have yet to see despair win. I've witnessed quite the opposite. Just 3 weeks ago, near Syracuse, federal agents raided a snack bar factory in Cato, New York. They detained 57 workers, many longtime employees and many parents with very young kids. Some now face deportation, others are still in detention. They're separated from their families. Children have been taken from their parents, and it's horrific, and sadly, we know it is not unique. Now, that same week, folks from the rural and migrant ministries came to our regular interfaith partners meeting. 2 organizers, still in the thick of it, shared what was happening. They spoke through tears. Their exhaustion was visible, and their courage was astonishing. They hadn't even had time to process all this trauma, but they came, turning to their neighbors, knocking on doors, trusting that when they asked for help, people really would respond. And y'all, they didn't ask us to abolish ICE. They didn't ask us to flood all the detention centers right that second. They didn't even ask us to raise $1 billion. Instead, they asked us, tell the story. They said, try not to forget what's happening in rural communities because they're not in the headlines. They said, spread the word that RMM is helping to reunite kids with their parents, and that all of us can pitch in small ways by covering a bit of the legal fees, rent, groceries, diapers, bills. They also said, and we asked point blank what else, and they said, remember this, Benz? You can pray for us. Those are little, teeny tiny, doable asks. But when we do them, one person at a time, then another, one tiny thing, one small act, one right next step, the effects go beyond what we can imagine. Because we're stepping towards each other into community, yeah, but also into the kingdom of heaven right here. I want to share with you one more thing. My routine is to write my sermons on Thursdays because I'm like that. So that's what I did on Thursday. But on Fridays, my routine is that I lead these sacred court support debriefings. So at noon each Friday, I gather with folks who have accompanied friends to immigration court during that week. Maybe they went to immigration court or biometrics appointment or an ICE check-in during that week. And we share. And it's heavy stuff, as you might imagine. So we build it into the program. Time to get together and just process some of it, talk about some of it, and pray. So this past Friday, we gathered. And the group shared, and some of the stuff that happened over the last 2 weeks was pretty just plain gutting. Really hard stuff to hold. So I asked folks, when you're in court, when all this stuff is going on, how are you staying steady? Even when you're scared, even when you're worried. We know that that's part of the design, to keep it chaotic and confusing, capricious, always changing. So how do you stay steady for your friend? I asked it. Jim came off mute. And as I know now, knowing Jim for this long, when Jim comes off mute, you listen. And he said this: the way I stay steady is to remember that I have just one thing to do. Get this person out of the building. That's it. That's my one job. I just need to do that one thing. He didn't know it, but he preached my sermon. He was living it, because that's really it. Do the one thing. Benz was also there and was literally in her car in between one accompaniment and a biometrics appointment. And it had been really rough that day. To answer the same question, Ben said this: the only thing keeping me going is you all. Community is too hard otherwise. That is the truth. I feel that, don't you, in my gut. Theologian Dorothy Sowell said, the opposite of suffering is not comfort, but community. To suffer with others, to discover God in the faces of those beside us, is to be saved. God's abundance flows through us, through connection. God's not bypassing us in order to make miracles happen. God is depending on us to show up in the small way we can. So when we lend what we have and trust one another to show up both in our fullness and in our emptiness, we participate in the creation of a new world that God is still dreaming for us. The oil of abundance still flows, friends, I'm convinced, but only when we're willing to knock on each other's doors, only when we trust that God's miracle comes through we, and not ever just me.